Welcome, everyone. We'll just give folks a minute to get settled and get on. Nice to see you all at this lunchtime. We do encourage eating, so please feel free to do that if this is the only hour you have. And I'm looking forward to this discussion today and having you all with us. So why don't we get started? Welcome to this CIN webinar on new perspectives on executive transitions. During our hour today, we'll engage in a conversation and you'll get to hear about the 3 phases of successful executive transitions, which include preparation, search and selection, and onboarding and ongoing support. We will have ample time for Q&A as well as discussion throughout this hour, so please be ready to unmute yourself when prompted and use the chat to engage with each other and our speaker today. We also recognize that this topic can be sensitive, so we hope that you can keep these conversations as confidential as possible while also making sure that we're making this topic more comfortable and easy for people to talk about, both here as well as after our hour today. So my name is Marie Hubbard, and I am a program manager for the California Improvement Network, also known as CIN. CIN is a learning and action network that strives to advance equitable healthcare experiences and outcomes in California through cross-sector connections, learning, and the spread of good ideas. CIN is a project of the California Healthcare Foundation and managed by Health Force Center at UCSF. You can learn more about our organizations on our websites. I will also share those links to our websites in chat shortly. So a few tips before we get started. Again, this is meant to be a conversation with each other and our speakers, so please be prepared to unmute yourself when prompted and use chat to engage. This webinar will be recorded, so for those and we'll be sharing it with all of you who are here with us today, as well as those who are unable to attend during this hour. If you're having any technical issues, please feel free to direct message me, and I'm happy to support you. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Ralph Silber, who's the former Chief Executive Officer of the Alameda Health Consortium and Community Health Center Network. I'm really excited to learn more from Ralph about his recent transition and to engage with all of you over the next hour. So with that, I will pass it off to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. By way of background, I recently retired last July after 40 years working with federally qualified health centers in Alameda County. And for probably the 5 or 6 years before I retired, did a lot of work on trying to make sure there was a successful transition to my successor. And now I'm having fun sharing with other folks lessons I learned, and I'm now saying lessons I am still learning from the experience. So hopefully I'm going to run through a little bit sort of things I learned out of this experience. And then, as Marie said, really looking forward to opening it up and having some conversation. Marie and I thought we'd start, as many of these do nowadays, with a couple polls, just to sort of know who's with us today. And I think that'll help me make sure that my comments are relevant to folks. So we're going to launch 3 polls at the same time. Take a second to answer them. We're going to chat for a minute and then come back and add a 4th poll. So Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hopefully everyone can see the polls on their screen now. We'll give everyone some time to answer. Looks like we have some responses coming in, which is great. You can scroll down to get to all 3 questions. All right, Another few seconds for our last folks. Okay, end the poll and I'll share the results. So hopefully you can see those.
So if I scroll down, am I going to see it? Right.
It should pop up on your screen, but I can also share a bit about what we're seeing. So we see a large group of folks on the call, our CEO or executive directors. We have a few senior leaders and other staff, as well as a few consultants. The majority of the group has how long are they going to be in their role is 5 years or less, or how long, I'm sorry, have they been in their role is 5 years or less. And then 6 to 10 years is the next grouping for that answer. And the third one is how soon are you thinking you might want to transition? A few folks said ASAP. The majority of folks said between 1 to 3 years or more than 3 years. And a smaller number said not even thinking about it.
Great, thanks, Marie. So that's great that we have a real mix of folks in terms of what their current role is, how long they've been there, and what they're thinking about for the future. So I want to say, even at the outset, in some ways, part of my mission is accomplished, which is I'm kind of proselytizing for people to be thinking about these issues sooner rather than later. So I'm really excited and appreciative that folks have showed up, not just because they have one foot out the door, but because they're earlier in the process as well. So that's really great. So I'm going to take a few minutes running through a pretty short PowerPoint. And then, as we said, we're going to open it up for some conversation. So Marie, you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, and did you want to do your other poll around the topics
I'm
that
sorry.
folks are most
Absolutely.
interested?
Thank you for reminding Marie. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. So this question, I'm going to launch it now. It's just topics you're most interested in, and you can check all that apply. So we have a few responses coming in. A big flurry of responses. We'll give another few seconds or so for those last responses. Right. Okay.
That's great. Again, maybe I feel like we could all just go have lunch, because I think the results of the poll address another thing that I'm going to talk about, which is traditionally folks really thought about succession planning just in terms of the organization, but I think preparing for it personally is equally important, and how to involve everybody, board, staff, partners. So the answers to these questions are actually really gratifying, that maybe not surprising, those of you who showed up today are already thinking more broadly about this topic than folks did historically. So that's great. Means I can run through my slides even more quickly and we can get to the conversation part.
Right.
Yeah. So I thought I would start by acknowledging some of the challenges that both I faced in my process, but also that I have heard from many other colleagues over the years, which is all of you, most of you have day jobs, have plenty of things on your plate, and intentionally or unintentionally, succession planning, preparing for transitions often gets dropped to the bottom of the list. So one of the challenges is just sort of making time and energy and space to start thinking about these issues. I think another challenge is that historically there's just been a lot of sort of secrecy about, oh, is so-and-so ever going to move on, and they've been there forever, and I think a sort of unhealthy secretiveness about these kinds of issues, and that often makes it hard to start the process. And I think particularly in my generation, not so much for some of those who are younger, There have been executives who've been in their role a really long time and just have a hard time imagining what else they're going to do with their life. And I think that in some cases has posed challenges both for leaders individually, but also for their organizations. And then for many of us who worked in nonprofit organizations where, for at least for the CEO, it's a board responsibility to manage this process. Often
Hi. Good.
Sorry, I'm having a little technical problem here for a second. Give me a minute.
Of course. Happens to all of us.
Marie, if you can hear me, let's just tell me that you're going to the next slide and I will keep talking, even though I can't see what's going on here.
Okay. Yeah, and sometimes if you keep your video off, it'll help with the bandwidth. And so if that's better, that's fine too.
Just give me 1 second. I will.
Okay.
See, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
So as we talk about this, and as I learned through my experience, there's really 3 complementary phases of succession planning, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these. On the graphic, they look like they're all sort of the same amount of time and energy, but in reality, they're not. So the first phase I actually think is the longest in terms of time and energy, which is how do you prepare both your organization and yourself for this transition? And this is the sort of biggest, longest, and I think in some ways most important phase of the process. The second phase, for an executive transition at least, is actually the process of searching and selecting a new executive. And fortunately or unfortunately, this is the phase that often gets the most time and energy and emotional energy. And I would argue in some ways gets a disproportionate amount of time and energy out of the 3 phases. The third phase is once an executive is selected, the onboarding and support for the executive. And I would say this phase gets too little attention in my experience. Often, whether you're a board of directors hiring a CEO or you're a hiring manager and you hire someone, you breathe a sigh of relief and you go back to your day job and you just sort of say, oh, well, we think we picked the great person, they're going to be fine, and don't really give them the necessary support to be successful. So these are the 3 phases that I experienced, and I think thinking more carefully about how much time and energy goes into each of these phases, it's going to help us all do a better job in this body of work. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a little Pollyannish on my part, but I am a little bit on a bandwagon of trying to help people think that instead of being sort of anxious and secretive about, oh, when's so-and-so going to retire, that we really should try to shift our thinking and see that organizations change and move on and develop, people move on and grow and develop, or whether it's to retirement or to other opportunities, and that this should be a more normalized and not such a secretive thing. And when it's done right, executive transitions, whether those are CEOs or other senior leaders, really can be opportunities for organizational growth and development. And in my case, in the last couple of years when I was still in my role, I really tried consciously to develop my senior team into a stronger bench, to step away from certain decisions, to delegate more. And I got to the point in the last year, as people came in to ask me really big questions, I would say, well, I think maybe X, but you're really going to have to live with the consequences if we spend $500,000 on this. What do you think? So embracing the process can be a way to really energize changes in your leadership team, new ideas, new approaches. And quite honestly, as an executive leader, it can actually give you a tool to do some things that you might otherwise want to do. So hoping this way of thinking about it might help people sort of move from that place of, I just don't know where to get started, to actually thinking that there can be an upside to engaging more thoughtfully and how do you prepare both your organization and yourself for this kind of transition. Let's go to the next slide. So I read one of the corporate books about succession planning, and I took away one sentence from that book, which was, the day you get a job as any kind of senior leader, part of your job is succession planning. And I think that that's really true. Again, whether you're a CEO or you're some other kind of senior leader, it's about having an emergency succession plan in place. It's about really thinking intentionally about leadership development at all levels in your organization. For those of us who work in the nonprofit setting, this is where board development would come into play, to really make sure you have the right people on the board, you have the right people in your executive roles on the board. They have the ability to communicate, talk about difficult issues. It's also about the nuts and bolts of your organization. Do you have a relatively good balance sheet? Do you have the HR infrastructure that you need? Do you have decision-making? Do you have the IT? So across the whole gamut, from leadership to finance to board to organization, I actually believe this body of work, which goes in that first phase, is actually the best.
Oh, I think you're back.
Yeah, have you not heard me?
No, we did. You were just
Oh.
saying about this body of work. This comes from the first phase. That's where this body of work is part of.
Yes, and that I think this is actually the body of work that's most important in trying to set your organization up for a successful transition. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know if I'm repeating myself, but this involves everything from leadership development to board development to organizational development. It's the full gamut of what's going to make your organization successful today and also help prepare you for the transition. Yeah. So the phase that everybody gets sort of most focused on is the actual search and selection process. And again, some of this applies whether you're talking about a CEO search and selection or another senior leadership process. On my soapbox about trying to get less secretive and more transparent about this, I think being really thoughtful from the get-go about what you're going to communicate about the process, to whom you're going to communicate it, how you're going to communicate it, is really important. And for all of us who've been through change management training, this is really just basic change management 101. The more you communicate with people, the more comfortable they're going to be with the process and the outcome. I think another thing that we're now seeing is some new thinking about who's sort of at the table, maybe in different seats, but who's at the table for the search and selection process. I think her traditional thinking was being, if this is a CEO role in a nonprofit, it was only the board of directors. They're going to go in a secret room and pick the search firm and interview the candidates, and sort of like selecting the next pope, they're going to send smoke up the chimney, walk out the room and tell everybody who it was. I think now there's much more thinking about how to involve lots of different people in different ways, for sure. And how you involve different people will certainly depend on your organization. But I'm suggesting that when you get to this point in the process, that there's at least a conversation about the outgoing CEO, your senior leadership team, other staff members, your board members, key external partners or funders. Ask a question of, to what extent should they be involved in the process? Yes or no, how, and how is that going to be communicated? And again, that's going to vary from organization to organization, but I think all of those parties have something to bring to the process of both selecting a search firm, working with the firm, coming up with the criteria for the person you're looking for, and then ultimately making that selection. I think the other thing that I have seen, I'm guessing many of you have seen, is with a CEO search, the board hires a firm and they feel like, okay, we're done now because we're paying the firm a ridiculous amount of money. They're going to do all the work. We're going back to our day jobs. And I think even if you talk to search firms now, they will say that's a mistake. The search firm it might be your leader, your facilitator, but just like any other vendor, there is a vendor management role with the search firm. And you really want to make sure that with the board and whoever else is involved in the process, they're really partnering with the search firm. Okay, let's go to the next slide, Marie. This is one of my other soapbox issues is, and we're beginning to see this, people thinking more broadly about what kind of person can be an executive leader, again, whether that's a CEO or another senior leader. I think what we did in our case was the first task that we did both with our board, all of our employees actually, and with our key external partners, was just surveying everybody about what they thought were the most important qualities for, in our case, the new CEO, the person taking my role. And that's a nice way to give people some kind of input. You're not telling the staff or your external partners that they're going to get to pick who the leader is, but surveying all of those parties to say, you know, what are the things that are most important for the next leader? And then, you know, in terms of DEI, I think that's something we're all thinking about. I will say in my experience, a couple things I've learned. Organizations who think the DEI work in terms of hiring a leader starts when they're hiring the leader are not well positioned. Doing the DEI work is work that we all are doing or should be doing and needs to be done ahead of time. You know, what does your board composition look like? What does your senior leadership look like? What kind of roll up the sleeves hard work are you doing about addressing equity issues within your own organization? Then I put that the last bullet is my own personal weakness, which I've fallen victim to over and over again. And I see this sometimes with CEO hires, which is being overly influenced by leaders who are very charismatic. And you know, many times being charismatic is an important positive attribute for leaders, but I think it's really important to make sure as you're considering candidates that you are trying to look beyond sort of how they present themselves to what they actually bring to the requirements of the position. Let's keep going, Marie, so we can. Yeah, so this last area is how do you support the new executive? And again, I think what I have certainly seen, and I bet you a lot of you have seen, is once you hire someone, whether it's the CEO or your CFO, everyone is so relieved you finally fill the position, they all sort of walk away. But I think it's really important if we want to support people in their new roles, to really think intentionally and to think before a new person starts, what are all the things we're going to wrap around that new executive in order to make sure that he or she is successful. And I've just put on this slide the 6 sort of potential sources of support for a new leader. And again, what this looks like in any particular situation will depend on the organization, the new leader, the outgoing leader. But I think all 6 of these boxes represent potential sources of support for a new leader. And I think, and it's an ongoing process, and I think almost always does not get enough attention. Let's see, I think, is there one more slide? Yeah, so I started with the challenges, and I thought I'd, in the last slide, just reiterate some of the recommendations I've made. One of is I urge or challenge each of you to think about sort of right away, what are some of the things you can start doing, whether that's personally or in your organization, to sort of start on this journey. My other recommendation is to think about what the potential role is for all the different parties in the sandbox. And again, that's going to differ by who that constituency is, what your organization is. But I think the more we widen who's at the table, the better off we're all going to be. And then my communicate. This should be a normal set of conversations that we're all having. I think thinking more openly about leadership, I think one of the biases that has often been is someone who's a COO isn't a good candidate to be a CEO. People who are good at operations are not good at executive roles, or, well, the job description says you have to have a master's degree. Well, there's a lot of great leaders who don't have master's degrees. I think opening our eyes, obviously, about race and ethnicity, about gender, I would also say about age. There's a lot of amazing people in the field who might not fit preconceived notions that many of us have, but we're better off thinking more broadly about the kind of people who are going to support our organizations going forward. And again, the last point, which I've now said ad nauseum, is to try to normalize for all of us that we are talking about leadership transitions as part of organizational growth and development and resiliency. I'm going to stop there, Marie, and hand it back to you to help us have a conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have a few, thank you so much, Ralph, for walking through those slides. And we have a few questions in the chat already. I am going to actually shake things up a bit and ask those who put questions in the chat to open your line and introduce yourself and ask your question. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, feel free to just say no. That's fine, but wanting to just encourage a conversation. So Nicole, you had your first question, and welcome you to introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Nicole Bussing, and I'm the Chief HR Officer for Santa Cruz Community Health. And we are fortunate that our CEO has given us a lot of time, not just a 12-month period, but also flexibility that she could leave earlier if needed or stay longer. So that's really the best scenario. I think so many times we find ourselves almost in an emergency situation. So that's not the case here. We've been referred to a couple of big search firms like out of New York, and I understood that they charge about a 33% fee. So if the position for the newcomer is at $300,000, we'd be paying the search firm $100,000. I wondered if that was a typical arrangement, or if there are recruiters that do more flat fee. That's been my experience, that we've had a $30,000 recruitment for a chief medical officer.
Yeah, I mean, others can chime in. My experience is for CEO level recruitment, 30% is a going rate.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that I think a good practice is that there's a cap to that, so that in your scenario, just say, let's say the person ends up, you hire someone who's fabulous and they negotiate a salary of $400,000, that the firm's not getting 30% of $400,000. So I think the best contracts I see these days have a percentage and a cap.
Very good.
Because otherwise you're creating a financial incentive for the firm, who often is in the middle of these contract negotiations,
sure,
to make it, more and more and more.
As a piggyback to that question, please, how do you go about selecting a firm that you want to work with?
Yeah, so before I answer that, I will say I think it's really important to think carefully about what you're looking for in a search firm. Because I think traditionally there's been this very narrow idea, we're going to hire a search firm, they're going to go look around the country and they're going to find a perfect candidate for us. I bet you a lot of you have had the same experience I have, which is you hire a search firm and you end up hiring someone that you already knew. Not that that always happens, and not to say that that's not worth hiring a search firm, but I do think depending on your organization, it may be important to have a search firm who is going to guide your organization through what can be a very emotional, stressful process. So for example, lots of times folks have internal candidates. That's a very delicate process to balance. So a really good search firm will come to you with some tools in their tool chest about how to manage that. You know, do you have a board who doesn't have a lot of experience doing this? So you want a search firm that really has some sort of board development perspective. They're going to know how to work with your board. So I think the first step is figuring out really clearly, like, what are the services you really need to be getting? Then the traditional practice these days is you issue an RFP and send it out to firms and get the just like you would do for another kind of vendor. But I think the thing I often see people not doing before they look for a firm is actually thinking about what are the services they're trying to get.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Great, thanks. Sarita, can I ask you to open your line, introduce yourself, and ask your question?
Sure. My name is Sarita Kohli. I'm CEO of AKI, Asian American School Community Involvement, which is in the South Bay. And Ralph Dolores speaks very highly of you all the time. I guess my question was, here in Silicon Valley, we've seen the Ravenswood CEO, Louisa, who gave, a long notice to the board, but also appointed somebody, deputy CEO, who was already there. And so she's been grooming him and given 18 months of notice, I think, to do that. Raimundo has done the same for Gardner. I'm kind of wondering what the current CEO's role becomes during that transition period when they've already made that announcement, and what is the organizational impact there? And if you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I know all those individuals, so I'm not going to comment on those particular situations. One thing I'd say is, if I were better, I'd have a graphic which is the words best practices and one of those lines through it, because I think there is no simple answer to these questions. I will say on this issue of sort of internal candidates and outgoing CEOs grooming people, there are different schools of thought. And I've seen that work really well, where a long-term CEO finds someone on the team, works with them over years, gets them inside help, outside help, training, tells the board, I'm really grooming Susie, and it can work great. There's also a school of thought that at the end of the day, that's really the board's decision. This is not royalty. I'm not appointing my son to be my successor. So I don't think there's any simple answer, but I think it's important to be really thoughtful about that. And the more communication and discussion there is, I think the better off you are. Personally, I think it's really hard to have two people in charge at the same time. And I think I can say this. My successor asked me to jump on a Zoom last week with some people on the team, basically to share some historical information that I'd done a very poor job of putting into a format. And it was a little funny because the new person, Andy, some of you know, is on the call and she's doing a great job, but I'm on the call with my team and they're like asking me questions and asking me what to do. And I was like, I'm not in charge here anymore. So again, it partly depends on the people, but I think, and I say this to the people, particularly in my role, the old-time CEOs, it's really important to set up our successors for success, because otherwise we're not passing on the heritage.
Great, thank you so much. Paula, can I ask you to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Sure. I'm Paula Wilson, and I work at Valley Community Healthcare in the Los Angeles area. Ralph, I'm wondering what you learned. You said you're going to share some of your lessons learned, but when you ultimately, how do you help the board take the reins? And our boards are have patients and have day jobs and come once a month and may or may not have been involved in any kind of search before. So I'm a little concerned in their capacity to do this. So.
Yeah, Paula, I totally agree. I think it's a really, not in all cases, but in many cases, it's a weak point because it's not a task they've been asked to do before. So I don't have any easy answers. I would say for people who, this is one reason to be thinking about board development, because you should be thinking about board development. So some of the basic building blocks of board development: do you have turnover? Do you do board training? Do you have the right people in officer positions? Have you worked on communication? Have you helped them talk about conversations where they have different opinions? I mean, sort of just some of the basic building blocks of trying to support your board, which sometimes we don't pay enough attention to because we're, turning on the lights, right? But I think this is yet another reason to just go back to some of the ABCs of board development. Another idea I said is, if you're looking for a search firm, I would put this at the top of the list, is to really try to find a firm that is going to demonstrate to you that they've been around this block before, that they have some tools in their tool chest to offer about how to support a board that doesn't have a lot of experience. I think the other thing is, what's an appropriate role for the outgoing CEO, right? It's not your job to pick the successor, but I think there are some things about sort of the nuts and bolts of the process that can be appropriate for the outgoing CEO to do. Are you going to have an executive assistant provide some kind of support? Yes or no? I will tell you the truth. I had conversations with my board CEO. Part of that was managing the search firm. Have you heard from the firm? I haven't heard from the firm. They said they were going to do this. They didn't do it. We were supposed to have the candidates. Who's setting up the Zoom, right? So I am a firm believer that when it's time for the outgoing CEO to move on, they should move on. But I'm also a firm believer that they have a role to play in supporting the board in taking the lead in this.
Great, thanks. I'm going to invite my colleague Rebecca Hargraves to ask her question.
Hi, thanks, Marie. I'm Rebecca Hargraves from Health Force Center at UCSF, and I'm part of the CIN program office team. A lot of what I've observed is that when new leadership happens, that it's often followed by turnover in other positions over like the next 6 months, the next year. I'm curious what your experience has been, or any insights you have about when a CEO or other senior leader, that their exit is announced, but it doesn't happen for a while. And does turnover still happen then? Or what tips do you have to manage and support other leaders and staff about the coming changes?
Yeah, really good question. Definitely happens. And I'm sure we've all seen every variation of this. I will tell you one thing that worked for me was emergency succession planning, emergency succession plans. So for 38 years, I didn't have an emergency succession plan. No one on my senior team did. But as we started doing this work, we did the exercise of everybody on the senior team having an emergency succession plan, which was really interesting because it both involved people saying, if I win the lottery, I'm not here today, someone else on the leadership team is going to take my role. And in some cases, it was a middle manager next down. So some of you may know Dr. Laura Miller was my CMO. About 8 months before I was going to leave after 40 years, she came in, closed the door and said, I hate to tell you this, but I'm leaving too. And it actually turned out we literally had the same last day. But in that case, she had been supporting the doc who reported to her. And he had a coach, he was involved in a training program, he was being exposed to all the different parts of the CMO role. And he was able very successfully to move into the CMO role. So I think, part of my answer, Rebecca, is just this thing about building out the bench strength, both horizontally and vertically, because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, Dr. Miller left not because I was leaving, but it was time for her to move on to something else. And then you're right, whether it's before or after a CEO transition, there are lots of reasons that people may come or go. I think the answer is the same as preparing for the CEO transition. The stronger your organization is, the more bench strength you have, the better connections you have to partners to help you find new candidates. I think it's the same kinds of things you can do to try to protect the organization from those kinds of transitions.
Thank you. That's helpful. And if I may take the liberty, since I think there's not a next question in the queue. What about the part of, managing everyone's feelings about things and the emotions? Change is hard. It's scary. There's a lot of people, unknown. And so not necessarily in that immediate circle of the other senior leaders, but sort of throughout the organization. If you have any tips or advice about that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, well, depending on the situation, it is often very emotionally charged, and people can be very attached to and what's going to happen to me. So, for us, one of the things was communication. So I let people know pretty early on what my plans were. I think in the last 6 or 8 months, every staff meeting, we provided an update about where we were in the process. And it's not like we let everyone in the staff decide who the boss was going to be, but there were regular reports to people. I think once we did a whole staff meeting where someone else, not me, on the senior team laid out the whole process, everything we were doing in terms of knowledge transfer and leadership development and board development and strategic planning. So, communication doesn't take away people's anxiety, but I do think it helps manage people's anxiety. And then just recognizing that it can be an emotional process. The other thing that we did, I was a little selfish. I had multiple gatherings and parties and celebrations, which were both for me, but also hopefully provided some kind of comfort for everybody else on the staff and our partners, that I was joyful about leaving. I was very excited about who was taking my job. So I tried to message that this was a happy occasion. This wasn't a sad thing. So those are a couple of suggestions of things we did.
Thank you.
Sarita, I saw your question in the chat, but wanted to just ask a quick question, then I'll pass it off to you. I know at the beginning, at the top end, people shared that what they're thinking about is they're not sure how to prepare, or they don't know what they need to prepare. And so I'm curious, Ralph, if you could share a little bit about, as you were preparing for this transition, like what were things that came through your mind? What were your concerns as this was, as you were starting this process and starting to share with your colleagues about this transition?
Yeah, thanks, Marie. I will tell you that I turned into a geek about all this stuff, and I actually went to a 4 days residential program about preparing for this. And the first 5 minutes, the leader said, part of the process of preparing for your, in my case, retirement, is preparing your organization, but the other half, equally important, is preparing yourself. And I remember having a flash, like, I just got my $5,000 worth. I can leave for the rest of the 3.5 days. But just that notion that part of this, and again, whether you're transitioning to retirement or transitioning to another role, is preparing yourself. So, there's the basic, like, financial things. Can I afford to either retire or take a different role? What's going to happen with my benefits? What's going to happen to my social connections I have with work people? Do I have something else to do? Do I want to retire into doing no work? Do I want to do some? If you're transitioning to another job, what kind of job? But I think naming that this isn't just about the organization, it's about you as a person. and really thinking through what all of those kinds of things are. I will tell you that one of my health center CEOs retired exactly when I did. She left the state. I mean, she decided that this was her chance to go live in a different community and a different environment. So people make different decisions, but really thinking through, and there's also this stuff about sort of positional status. For those of us who had fancy schmancy titles and people returned our phone calls and invited us to conferences, is that going to go away? And are you going to feel like it's such a relief? Or are you going to feel like, oh, I don't feel so important anymore. No one's calling me. I think we owe it to ourselves to do our own personal work of knowing what those transitions are going to be like for us. And I will tell you, I'm 7 months in. It's different now. And to be perfectly honest, the first few months I did no work. I didn't really talk to any work people. I was really glad to be done. And now I do feel a tiny bit of, how come I don't have more emails in the morning? I don't have any text messages. So it's a process, you know, it doesn't just end when you move on to whatever you're moving on to.
Great, thanks, Ralph. Sarita, can I ask your question?
Yeah, so, you know, I think when we think about succession planning of the type that you have gone through, it's a retirement type succession planning, and there's plenty of time to prepare for that. But when a CEO transitions to a different job, often there isn't that much time. So of course, in theory, we should all be doing all that succession planning right now. But do you have any words of advice for someone that makes, you know, a transition within a couple of months or 3 months or something like that?
Yeah, that can be much more challenging, and of course some of us have been in situations where that wasn't like a cool groovy thing. It was a problematic thing, right? So these are simple answers, but having emergency succession plans, I mean, who would take over? You know, we used to say if you got hit by a bus, now we say if you won the lottery. So it's the emergency succession plan for the CEO. But again, I'm a little bit of a broken record and it's a little bit simplistic, but how strong is the rest of your team? And I will say, I can speak for me because I'd been there so long. I did a very bad job of having information recorded and available in a way that other people could access. So that was a risky situation. And quite honestly, I think the person who's taken my job, I apologized to her the other day because so much of that stuff was in my head. So I think trying to make sure as much as possible that institutional knowledge is spread outside the CEO. I think the other thing that we've all seen is the CEO should not be the only person who holds important key external partnerships. And again, for, you know, sort of charismatic leaders, outward facing leaders, that's often the part of the job they really like. So they've got the relationships with the funders, the elected officials, the county officials, you know, whoever. I think in a healthy organization that they're sharing that. For many reasons, they should be sharing that. And obviously the case of an unexpected transition is just another reason. So, you know, starting to take people with you when you go meet with the mayor or your board of supervisors or the head of your health plan or something. I think that's, you know, a lot of these things I think are good organizational practices and they help you prepare for a transition, whether that's planned or unplanned.
Thank you.
Appreciate the camaraderie message there, Noam. So if she said she'll text you in the mornings now, Ralph. So any other questions? Feel free to open your line or put it in chat. I have two, but I don't want to, you know, take the space from others. So feel free to jump in if you do have questions. We have about 10 minutes left together. Ralph, you had just mentioned one of the things that you wish you had done differently, which is recording information more for the person who took over for you. What would you say you're most proud of from your transition? Some big piece of advice that worked really well for you that others could utilize?
I'm a little uncomfortable with proud. I think things that I'm glad I did is I started really early. And I do think that all things being equal, whatever getting started looks like, the earlier you start, the better. Because I bet you most of us have seen the opposite example, which is the outgoing person thinks, I shouldn't tell anybody anything until I'm absolutely sure I'm leaving and when I'm leaving, and I shouldn't do it too soon. So they call their board chair and say, I'm leaving in 12 months, you know? So I think earlier rather than later, and that can look different, right? I mean, I did not get up in front of my staff of 125 people 5 years ago and say, I'm leaving. But I started mentioning it to people on the board. I started mentioning it to senior leaders. I started mentioning it to our most important external partners. And then I got very deliberate in the last 6 or 8 months about, saying it more officially to more people. So I think getting started, I'm really glad that, I have a lot of family history about secrets being really bad. So I think not being secretive about it. And I will tell you, if anyone was here, we had a local partner had a public event. And before I had sort of announced publicly that I was leaving, he got up and said something. It was his event. He said, oh, I'm really glad Ralph is here. And as you all know, Ralph's retiring soon. And it wasn't like a big top secret, but I had not publicly said it. And I had a moment of like, oh, I can't believe he just said that. And I was like, it's fine, Ralph, right? So trying to, be more open about these things. I just think that's healthy.
It definitely gets back to, I think, what we shared at the beginning, which is, right, at some point in this, it is a bit confidential because the rest of the team doesn't know, or the rest of the organization, but ultimately these are things that we hope others will feel more comfortable talking about, because it's not top secret, and it's not a bad thing that people are transitioning or retiring. So one last question for you, Ralph, which is, what is one final message you either want to reiterate or add that you want to leave with this group as they're thinking about executive transitions, either for themselves or within their organization?
Yeah, I would say that it was and is a fun and satisfying process for me. And I think for those of us who are used to running organizations, at least in my experience, it's used a different part of my brain and my spirit and my thoughts. And, I think most, if not all of us on the call are doing the work we're doing because we believe in a mission. And if we're really true to that mission, doing this really intentional, thoughtful succession planning is part of our responsibility. Just like turning on the lights and balancing our budget and providing services for our communities, doing the work to sustain and grow and thrive our organizations, which requires this kind of planning, it is also part of our responsibility.
Great, thank you so much, Ralph. Any final questions or thoughts that you want to share? All right. Well, we'll give everyone 6 minutes back to their day. I'm just going to launch a quick poll, which we use as part of our evaluation. For those who are still on the line, please take a moment to do that. But thank you so much, Ralph, for spending the hour with us and sharing your wisdom and experience with this group. And thank you to all of you who joined today. Look out for an email from us. We'll be sharing this recording with you, and we hope to see you on a next CIN webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.